So yeah, so we'll get started. And just so you know, I have some folks that are webinaring with us. So I'm broadcasting and I'm recording the broadcast for them. So just an open disclosure, so folks know what's going on. Um, and obviously everything is focused on me, so it will not be on you. So when you heard this idea of the pricked heart, what were you thinking we might talk about, or what were you hoping we might talk about? And are you also in couples class today? Okay, sweet, 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 sweet. So hopefully you'll see maybe how this can be relevant to that particular class. But when you heard the prick chart, so you said you thought about anger.
Yeah, well, just more like a hardening, and then from that hardening, more of an angry, like, out.
Okay.
Like outer appearance.
Okay. So more of an angry kind of thing is what you're thinking, and then from that or from that hardening of the heart, yeah. Sometimes that can be making anger or defensive anger. Okay. Okay.
That's right.
All right. Cool. 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 How about you? What were as you take it?
Like being harmed and having that feeling reaction, but then learning from it and overcome it. And that's stuff.
Yeah. So overcoming kind of harm, working through it, learning how to deal with it, that kind of stuff. Okay. Cool. And yourself?
Oh, I'm just thinking more in terms of just how people how they become hardened in general, and just how it's looking some ways to connect with people, even the way our society is now. Just everybody's kind of busy and on their cell phones and not making eye contact.
Yep.
Things like that.
Yeah. And all of those dimensions that you kind of mentioned are things that we will talk about, right? So this idea of the pricked heart. So there, did anyone see the movie The Ten Commandments? No. Okay. So Charlton Heston back in the day made this movie called The Ten Commandments, and in that movie, it showed a biblical story of the Exodus. And so it tells the story of Moses leading the people out of Egypt. Now, what I find interesting about that story is that there were lots of warnings that Pharaoh had that he should let these people go. There were these plagues that came, right? And so all of these plagues came, and Moses kept saying, "Look, Pharaoh, let my people go, and these plagues will go away." And he was like, "No, I'm not doing it." And as a matter of fact, the more the plagues came, guess what Pharaoh did? He dug in his heels, right? Until his heart was hardened, right? So he got to a certain point where he couldn't let the people go because he had so much at stake in their captivity that it would actually undermine his identity to even let them go, right? And so sometimes when we think we're having a conflict with someone, and we'll talk about, oftentimes conflicts are illusions that we create, right? Sometimes we get so dug in that we can't find a way out. But what I told my students is something that we all know, right? So Howard Glasser, right? I mean, William Glasser, not Howard. Howard does some other things, but William Glasser came up with something called the what? The choice theory, or the control theory, right? And that theory basically says that no one can make you do anything, right? Everything that you do is a choice that you make. And so one of the things I told my students, because sometimes they would find themselves in pretty tricky predicaments, right? So I'm talking about high school students. Some of them were loudmouths. Some of them were antisocial. because of things that had happened to them, right? And so sometimes their mouths would get them into situations that they thought that their fists could get them out of. But what they were finding was that the world was changing and that their fists couldn't get them out of all of those situations because the people that they were bumping up against had more fists than they did, right? And so one of the things I told my students, I said, even in the most impossible situation, I want you to recognize that you have a choice. You can still make choices, even in the most impossible looking situations. And why do we have to believe that? Why is that important to believe? That even in the most impossible situations, that you still have the ability to make choices. So to feel empowered and not like a victim. What else? To have hope. To have control, right? So it's very interesting to me to watch like Olympic athletes. And I'm watching this dive. This guy's diving off the high dive. And, you know, for the most part, it's like he's standing there, he jumps off, he does some flips, and he goes in the water. That's not how he sees it, right? So they showed an instant replay of, hello, come on in, come on in. They showed an instant replay of him doing a dive, and they showed so it's like 2 seconds, but they're showing hundreds of seconds of him flipping. And like he's doing intricate little things, and they point to him and say, well, at this second, he is manipulating this part of his body, and he's adjusting here, and he's doing this. And I'm looking at that, and I'm just like, that is just so phenomenal, because that's not what I saw. But he's able to see that because he is in control, right? He can slow down time and be able to make these split-second decisions. And so I think that's important for us to recognize as people who are being a part of relationships, when we're in conflict and all these things, that we always have decisions. And so I said to my students that even if a person comes up with a weapon and they say, give me your wallet, do you have a choice? Yes, you have a choice. Now, there's a choice that will help you walk away from that very, you know, but you always have a choice. And my students will say, well, what if you don't give them your wallet and they shoot you and they take the wallet? I said, your choice was not to give it to them. And so them taking it is different than you giving it up, right? So when we were talking about this idea, and for those of you who just joined us, we were just kind of talking about the concept of a pricked heart and kind of where that comes from. And so what were some of the things you were hoping we might talk about, or you wanted to at least explore during this lunchtime? And then I'll order the sandwiches, and then we'll really get going. What were some things you were hoping, or why did you choose this time?
I was thinking maybe like misunderstandings, and maybe thinking people are angry or something when they're actually not.
Okay. All right. So maybe misunderstandings around feelings and misunderstanding cues that people may be angry when they're not. Okay. Cool. Yes.
To be honest, I didn't know what pricked heart meant. So
Okay. Sweet.
Same here. I just like the name was kind of, it just intrigued me, and I like to learn, and so.
All right.
Like
Cool.
the healing process of a pricked heart. I was thinking maybe I was hoping you would maybe talk about that too.
Yeah.
The wounded heart, how to heal a wounded
Yeah. How to heal a wounded heart and pricked heart. Okay. Cool. So let me order sandwiches right now. And what I'd like for you to do, in your handout, there is a chart. And in that, while I'm ordering sandwiches, there's some there, there's a few there. While I'm ordering sandwiches, I want you to fill out that chart. And there's some specific ways I want you to fill out the chart. If the groups on the left taught you positive things or said positive things about the groups across the top, I want you to put a X in the box. If the groups on the left tried to teach you or said negative things about the groups across the top, I want you to put a minus. If the groups on the left never talked about or said anything about those groups across the top, I want you to put a 0. All right? You can have pluses and minuses in the same box, but the size of your plus and the size of your minus will dictate how much you learned, right? So a big plus means lots of positive, and a little minus means a little bit of negative. And if you don't have a pencil or something to write with, that's fine. You can either do it in your head or go retrieve one. It'll take me about.
Anybody want one? Please. Anybody else?
All right, cool. So I will go get those lunches.
How big the positive was, or how many positives? Like,
Big, I think.
okay. Hi, everybody. Oh.
As people come, if you can just catch them up.
Yes.
So he told us to put on this grid to put a plus if the group on the left taught you something positive about the group on the top to put a plus, and if they taught you something negative to put a minus.
And if they taught you nothing, to put the
So
zero.
yeah, and 0.
This is the second time. Is anybody using this? Yes, I use it. So is it 2 more plus? That's what I think we should ask.
This is growing up, is that right?
I don't know, I have one that's like when I'm growing up and now, I guess, but.
Can you repeat that question again for this number one?
Yep. So if the groups on the left taught you something positive or said positive things about the groups across the top, then put a plus. If they said something negative, put a minus. And if it's never anything they talked about, put a 0.
Does this kind of grow when you're growing up?
When you're growing up, yep. All right. So pluses, minuses, and zeros. I'm sure I did not give you enough time to really explore those. But as you were going down that list or that chart, was there anything that stood out for you that made you pause for a second and be very thoughtful? Yes.
I was just surprised at like the TV, movies, and media, how negative or zero, how negative and zeros I had in that.
Yeah. So you were surprised at how many negatives and zeros you had for media, TVs, and movies. Okay. Cool. Yes.
I was surprised in general for disabled Americans, like almost all the categories, like it was zero for me.
Okay.
Just like not.
So they're
It's kind
almost
of like that.
non-existent
Yeah.
in conversations and
Yep.
media, that kind of stuff. Yep.
And I was looked at the amount, I was kind of conflicted too, regarding the Asian Americans for me.
Uh-huh. So not having a lot of, so when you say conflicted, what do you mean?
Well, conflicted because I have friends that are that are Asian. I mean, I go to Asia a lot. I have friends, and yet we never had a conversation about their Asianness, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were people that I raised. So I said zero because we didn't have a, how those Asian. That's how I interpret it. It
Right.
was never that, so I put zero.
Okay.
I mean, even at school, everything TV is just that.
Okay.
But I wanted to say plus in it, like a zero and then maybe a plus on the inside.
Okay. Yeah. No, you can do whatever you want to do. It's your paper. But yeah, no, there's yes. So sometimes those pluses, I mean, those zeros can be positive, but more often than not, they're not. Right. And why is not talking about something, why can that be detrimental? Yes.
And unimportant.
So you could be making them invisible or unimportant. All right. What else? You can create misunderstandings. All right.
Denying your own biases.
What's that?
Denying your own biases.
You're denying your own biases and you're ignoring their existence. Right? I don't know if you have young kids. I have a 2-year-old. And when I'm not paying attention, when I'm physically there, but I'm not mentally there, she calls my name incessantly. Dad. And she made a mistake. She called me Andre one time. And I was like, no, you don't call me Andre. She's like, Andre. And I really paid attention. I was like, wait a minute. Right? Why is she calling me? Because I'm not recognizing her existence. And we're in the same room. Right? So even sometimes that not talking about something is can be detrimental, even though it may feel. So here's a go ahead.
Well, it makes me think of, so for Native Americans, I had zeros in a lot of categories except for school and workplace. I had like a positive, a negative, and a zero because I felt like with the messages that we received about Native Americans, like in school, we learned about them, but it was all about the past. Like we didn't learn anything. And I think that's very true. Like in lesson plans, like they talk a lot about Native Americans in school,
As
like their
if-
history, as if it was something that existed in the past, and they don't. I think I didn't understand because I grew up in a town where there wasn't a Native community, and I think it was like later that I was, I didn't grow up with. It was not anything that talked about it all. So I think that was a distinction for me, like. Yes, exposure, but only as a group that existed in the past, not as a current living.
Because
community.
they're extinct.
Right.
They're extinct, right? I mean, that's how they're treated,
how
right?
it's
So we
portrayed, yeah.
take the artifacts, we take the things about their culture, and we use them as if they don't exist, which is why the mascot thing is such an important thing to really talk about, because we act like these people aren't still here, and they are, right? Even the way we tell history and who tells history and that kind of stuff. So
In the media too.
and the media as
especially.
well, right? I love Johnny Depp, love him. Think he's a great actor. I was so mad at him for doing the Lone Ranger movie, even though it wasn't as stereotypical as I thought it was. But even trying to take that on and not changing some of those major parts of the narrative. I thought was problematic, and I think people caught on to that, and the movie didn't do so well as a result. And again, I love Johnny Depp, but I think that was a misstep, you know, in his career, kind of thing. What else, as you were doing the graph, what else stood out for folks?
So we're still out talking about what you were saying, the TV, movies, and media. African American, negative. European American, positive. 0 for Latino, 0 for Asian, 0 for disabled, and negative for Native American. So that was like, you know, it's almost like it would be a spike like that for me.
Mm-hmm.
That it's all positive, and then for any other. So it could have been really instead of zeros, negatives for everyone.
For everyone else. And anyone else find something similar with TV and movies? Okay, all right. So why do you think that is? Why is it? Why is it that media, TV, movies, and media have lots of negatives or even zeros in some cases?
African Americans are the ones that are producing them. And
Okay.
It's the story, it's the dominant story that's being.
So it's the dominant story that's being told. Okay. It's where the money is. Okay. Yeah. So you guys went down a path I wasn't going to go down, but I appreciate that. That was good. You know, I really wanted to talk about what the purpose of the media is, right? So media is very much driven by profits, right, and sponsors and so forth and so on. And I think it's interesting that as we look at news stories or expose, I mean, not so much exposés, but news stories or television programs, how well can situational comedies, sitcoms, actually deal with real human emotions and depths of character? Really well or not so well in a 30-minute chunk of time? Typically not so well, right? So the ones that did the best with that are shows that many of you may not have watched, but like there was a show called MASH, right? MASH did a wonderful job of talking about the human experience. Every one of their characters had these delightful things about them, and they had these flawed things. And right now, you know what? If Alan Alda said something, if he made a comment about something, and I questioned it, I wouldn't question it because Alan Alda said it, right? Like even, you know, he could be like a horrible person in real life, but his TV persona was so powerful that you just love that dude, right? And I think there have been very few shows that have actually kind of captured that kind of humanity that have done it really well. So what does media and movies do? What do they do best? They do best dealing with stereotypes. That's what they do best with. Right? Look at, you know, you can look at in any magazine, you can look at any commercial, and you don't see authentic human beings. You see stereotypes, you see shadows, you see straw men of real people, right? I would imagine that people who have herpes aren't really that excited about having herpes like they show in the commercials, right? They're like, oh, I got herpes, I'm going skydiving. I'm sure that's not, you know, at the forefront of it. They have more complex things to think about, right? And so that's what the media does, and it does it for a particular purpose, because it wants to continually give the illusion that you're not whole unless you buy these things, right? And so we'll talk a bit more about that as well. We know that all human beings are looking for safety, significance, and belonging, and that their methods for getting safety, significance, and belonging can be problematic. But we want the same things, right? We want very similar things, if not the same things, but our methods can be very different. And we call those methods culture. The methods that are differing, we call culture. So when we start looking at why this group does this thing or does that thing, we have to recognize that they do it. The central purpose is the same reason we do it. However, their methods of doing that may be different. right? So it was funny. I had and I may have told this story before, but there was a woman in one of my trainings, and she said, "Andre, why is it that all the colored people are moving into my neighborhood?" Right? And the audience was like, "Colored," right? And so, what was my responsibility to this woman? As the leader, the teacher, the lecturer, what was my responsibility to this woman? To educate her? Educate her on her language? My primary responsibility was, go ahead.
What's the problem with different people living in your neighborhood?
That could be a question, right? That could be a discussion. Hey, how are you? There's a handout right there for you. Yep, right on top. And no, that could be a question, right? And so whether it's the language I needed to talk about or even explore that question, the first and foremost thing I needed to do was answer her question. I need to answer her question. Because later we can talk about the language you're supposed to use. And then once I answered her question, we can talk about why might that be a problem and have greater depth. But she had a sincere question. So I had to answer that sincere question because she did not recognize that the people who are moving into her community are moving for the same reason she moved there. Right? And so we'll talk about how do we start to do a mind shift to really look at our pricked heart. So if you go to the center of your handout, when we're talking about this idea of the pricked heart, yay, you can bring those right over here. And I will, yep, I'll sign that. Thank you. And do you know if they're marked?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. Which is which?
The 6 is the vegetarian, the 4s are the turkey.
Okay. 7. All right, here you go, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, can you do me a favor while you're here? Can you separate those out? Yeah. So when we talk about this idea of hello, we talk about this idea of the human soul. We talk about the pricked heart. One of the things that I don't know if you heard this as a kid, but people would tell me, "Don't wear your emotions on your sleeve." Anyone ever hear something like that? Or don't be too emotional? Or okay. So I was and I'm still a very sensitive human being, but I was a very sensitive kid. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, man. And so I was also intuitive, right? So that combination, I would get my feelings hurt a lot. Did anyone else get your feelings hurt a lot as a child? Right? Yeah. Thank you, sir. So you got your feelings hurt as a kid. And what was your remedy for that? Or what did the adults around you tell you was the remedy for that? Buck it up. Shake it off. Pull up your skirt. Go back to bed. Walk it off. Put in your big girl pants. It's all fine. Don't worry about it. What were they suggesting? Ignore that feelings. And what do we call that when we start ignoring our feelings on a regular basis?
Repression.
We call it maturation. Right? We call it being mature. You are mature when you can take on the ideologies and ignore. 6 is
But I got, I got a 4 section. Oh, okay.
okay. So 4s are turkey, 6 are vegetarian. So it's called maturation. When you start ignoring your feelings as much as possible and not being moved by those. Now, has anyone ever purchased a new pair of shoes? Right? Has anyone ever made the mistake of having an event that you have to go to and you have to wear those new pairs of shoes? Anyone ever made that mistake? I certainly have made that mistake, right? And why is that a mistake? Because one would think new shoes would be a great thing to wear with a new outfit to an event. But why are new shoes problematic? because they haven't been broken in, and they end up hurting your feet. So, what's that?
You get a blister.
You get a blister. Now, I'm not so concerned about the blister. I'm not so concerned about the blister because the blister, it means that you tried something on, it didn't work, and so now you have this you know, you're eating, so I won't go into detail about what that looks like, right? So you have that thing. But after that healing process, what are you left with? A callus, right? You're left with a callus. Why? Because you tried on something that didn't necessarily fit, and now your body is trying to adapt to that context and that situation. So you develop this callus. Now, I don't want to go into great detail about this, but I think you can see where this metaphor might be going, because they have these things called pumice stones. And why do they have pumice stones? To remove calluses that we don't want there, right? Now, in Western society, we have a thing about feet and a, you know, somewhat of a fetish, where in other parts of the world, calluses are necessary because shoes aren't as prevalent, right? So here we are trying to remove calluses where they, and oftentimes are trying to build calluses because shoes aren't as prevalent. So context becomes extremely important. So context is everything in terms of looking at this idea of a callus. And so how do these calluses form? Calluses start to form when the human soul has been fractured in some way. The human soul has been fractured. And what kinds of things are fracturing the human soul? Because there's an onslaught all the time on our soul. What kinds of things are working to fractionate or trying to fracture our human soul? What's that? Capitalism could be one, right? Capitalism could be one. Traumas, grief, hurtful comments, racism, sexism, heterosexism, right? Gender binaries that aren't purposeful, right? These are all onslaughts on trying to crack the human soul. Now, the interesting thing about once the human soul is cracked, there's a phenomenon that produces itself or that presents itself once that crack happens. What we know is that when the body is connected with the spirit, we have wholeness, we have balance, we're complete. But when the body is separated from the spirit, the body becomes a thing, right? The body becomes a thing. We have a tradition in my family of for funerals. I remember my grandmother, we stuffed her in this long, expensive box, and people all came to look at my grandmother, and people passed notes to my grandmother. They said things to my grandmother, and some people wanted to touch my grandmother, which was kind of gross, right? But how did my grandmother respond while she was in that box, in that auditorium full of people? She didn't respond, right? Because my grandmother was dead. She had passed. Her spirit had left her body, and her body had become a thing, right? Now, later, we went to her house, and we'd have spaghetti dinner, and let me just tell you, you don't eat everybody's spaghetti, because some of it was just nasty, right? But we have spaghetti dinner, we're telling stories, we're looking at pictures, all this stuff, and it feels like my grandmother is there with us. But her spirit can't animate anything, right? And so when the spirit is separated from the body, the spirit then becomes powerless, or has less power than it did when it was in the body. And so all of these things that we talked about capitalism, we talked about racism, we talked about heterosexism, and we talked about sexism, are things that are designed to create a crack in the soul. And when a crack in the soul occurs, the phenomenon that appears is called a void. There is a void, or you'll hear people say, I have a hole in my soul, or they have a hole in their soul. And when that hole appears, what is our inclination? To fill it. And so capitalism says, what? What's capitalism's answer to the hole in my soul? Buy stuff to fill it, right? But our avatars have taught us that that doesn't work. Robin Williams, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix. I would go as far as to say Prince taught us that buying things, drugs, alcohol, cars, relationships, we can consume all of those things, but they'll never fill our soul. Why? Because it's not material. What's supposed to go there? The body and the spirit are supposed to be in relationship. And when that relationship doesn't happen, we have dis-ease. We have dis-ease. And so we'll talk later about how do you bring that body and soul together. And so one of the ways we cope, those of us who don't necessarily fall into the trap that consumerism or capitalism offers us, is that we start forming walls around our heart, around that void. We want to build a castle so that we don't continually feel hurt, or we don't allow certain things to fall into that void, as opposed to even dealing with the void. Right? So we start building a callus. Now, when we talk about this idea of the pricked heart, there are tons of things that we experience in life that can give us calluses. Trauma is one of those, right? It makes sense that I don't trust people because I've been violated in some kind of way, be it physically or emotionally. That makes sense. That's a callus. It's a callus. I grew up and I had to be tough in my neighborhood, so I developed this psychic armor. So now I walk around with this psychic armor, prepared for anything, because I never know what I might face. You know, and if any of you are planning on working with young people, there's this concept called mean mugging. And that's when someone's looking at someone else without the intention of doing something pleasant to them, or pleasantly looking at them. We also might call it hard eyes, mean eyes, right? Mean mugging. But my psychic armor says I can defend against mean mugging by being a meaner mugger, right? So yeah, right? Have you ever seen people who, sometimes it demonstrates, particularly in males, as being hyper masculine? A man's man, have this psychic armor, right? But what happens when I'm in an intimate relationship with someone and I'm wearing the psychic armor everywhere I go? I take a shower with the psychic armor. I eat breakfast with the psychic armor. I go to sleep with the psychic armor. We're trying to have an intimate partner conversation and I'm wearing my psychic armor. How does that relationship work? Not so well. Why? There's no connection.
Like you're isolated, you're not being vulnerable.
You're not being vulnerable. You're being isolated.
You're not letting the other person join your spirit.
You're not letting someone else into your inside spot. Your inside. So you're not joining spirits. You're not relating. You're not, because you have this barrier, which is your psychic armor. But I need this psychic armor. This psychic armor has allowed me to live and exist and blah, 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 blah. When does the psychic armor become problematic? When you're pushing other people away. But part of the job of the armor is to push people away.
Pushing people away that aren't.
When you start pushing away people you don't want to push away, right? Then it's time for a pricked heart. When what you're doing is no longer working for you, it's time to prick your heart. It's time to take off the armor, right? When your kids see you and they go, oh no, daddy, because you're coming in with your psychic armor, because they see fear or they see, right? Or something traumatic has happened to you and now you're trying to get over that and establish a new relationship, but you keep playing that trauma in your head, it's time to prick your heart. Now, one of the things I think is really interesting is that this idea of pricking the heart has to be a conscious decision that someone makes, because there are calluses on the heart. And calluses have been designed to protect it, actually. Right? It's not, the psychic armor is not really to be an offensive mechanism. It's actually to be a defensive mechanism. Right? I worked in a residential treatment center, and there was a young man there who had juvenile diabetes. And I don't know if you have or know young people with juvenile diabetes, but it's really stressful for kids. And back in those days, we didn't have the kind of science that we have now, so they probably could have regulated it just with diet. But we didn't know then what we know now. And so every day, 3 times a day, he would have to prick himself to take his blood sugar. And does anyone know anyone who's had to do that or seen that, right? Yeah. And the thing that was somewhat problematic about it was that he could not keep pricking himself in the same place. And why couldn't he keep pricking himself in the same place? A, it would never heal, but wouldn't get enough blood. He got calluses. So he had to be mindful and take track of where his pricks were going to be. So I'll prick myself here today, but I did this finger last week, so I need to skip that one. Let me do this one. Okay, so I'll prick this one tomorrow, but then I got to skip these 2 because, right? Very convoluted procedure, but necessary because he wanted to what? He wanted to keep living. He wanted to take his blood sugar. So he had to be mindful of where those calluses were and prick in places where they weren't, right? And so our hearts are very much the same way. And so how do we start to even talk about pricking that heart? So if we look at letter A, we talked a little bit about the human soul. Letter B are some things that start to happen once we get into this maturation process that helps us develop these calluses. We start getting a particular kinds of worldview. I think it's interesting, particularly when we talk about a kind of the social binary, that typically when white people get opportunities or advance, there's never a conversation that they got that in any other way than their skill and their talent. But when people of color, or specifically black people, oftentimes get those positions, there's always a question about what program got them there, as opposed to their skills, their talents, and their abilities, right? When young people on a college campus get excited and they burn cars and tear up things, we talk about that very differently than when there's social unrest, right? And so, although the artifacts of both of those can be very similar, we talk about them in very different ways. And part of that is to design a callus on someone's heart for or against a particular thing. And we call that callus bias, right? So bias becomes a callus that we have. This idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, what does diversity create? I would submit to you that diversity in and of itself does not create anything. It just is, right? It is a state of being. It's a state of recognition. And so if we're looking for something to create, then we have to create meaning for something. An example that I like to use is Michael Kors. Is anyone familiar with Michael Kors, the designer, right? How much is a Michael Kors purse worth? It's expensive. How much give me the $400? All right, cool. If Michael Kors makes a purse that's $400 and nobody buys it, how much is it worth? So if it's in the store and it's been there for 6 months and nobody's bought it, what does the store do? They lower the price. They put it on sale. And if they put it on sale and nobody buys it, what do? They put it on sale some more, right? So if they mark it all the way down to $10 and somebody buys it, how much is that Michael Kors purse worth? $10. It's worth what we give it. So when we talk about this idea of diversity, it really has no importance until we give it importance, right? So if we say this about diversity is important, then that becomes the value that it has, the importance that it has. Equity is just recognizing that people need to get what they want, what they need over what they deserve, sort of thing. And we'll talk about that in letter E. And then how do we include people, right? So as we try to move this idea of the pricked heart, we have to look at our mindset as a place to start looking at that. So letter E, equality is making sure everybody has the same things. Equity is making sure that people have what they need. And liberty is making sure that we remove any barriers to people participating in our system, right? And so, so that is that concept. So let's go down to letter H, because I think H is an important part of what we need to talk about in terms of this pricking of the heart, and then how do we turn that or heal that pricked heart. So if you've either taken a class from me in multicultural counseling, if you're taking one currently in multicultural art therapy or counseling, you will find out about this word called disparities. Has anyone heard that word before? Disparities. And what are disparities? Or how have you heard disparities used?
Differences in the amount that people have of either something or access to something.
Okay, so the
you
difference
get
of the
like
amount,
a gap.
like the gap between, okay. How else?
Like healthcare disparities, how often do people access healthcare, who actually has healthcare, where do they have healthcare?
So when they use this word disparities, is this a positive term? No, it's a negative term, right? So this idea of disparities is really focused on the negative aspects of things. So be it health disparities, employment disparities, racial disparities, gender disparities, all these things are focused on negative. So when we start thinking about our social categories, for example, on that number one, we think about those social categories. There are certain groups that fall in those disparities. They have these negative life outcomes as a part of what we call disparities, right? So here then comes the question. Because systemically, African Americans and Native Americans find themselves in a number of disparities when we look at these kind of social measures, right? So the question then becomes, is there something wrong genetically or culturally wrong with African Americans and Native Americans that they find themselves in those disparities across the board? Is there something wrong with them? Now, before some of you are shaking your head, before you respond to that, I just want that to kind of just bake for a second. Because the answer to that becomes extremely important. Because if the answer is yes, there's something wrong with them, then we need to send researchers out to find a vaccine, a medication, a program to help fix the problem, which is in the people, right? To heal that, because we got rid of polio, so we can get rid of all the things that might be if there is something wrong with them. But if there is not something wrong with Native Americans and African Americans, then what could be the explanation for why they're falling in those disparities? What do you think? What might be the explanation?
Environment?
So maybe environment, historical trauma, white privilege, institutionalized racism, systems, right? So if it's not the people, it could be. I imagine that there could be some systemic issues with why we're seeing the results that we are, right? And that goes back to this idea of impact versus intent. Don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but the law measures the impact. But in our human relations, we pick up on the intentions that people have. Some people can ask you for your number and you'll give it to them. Other people will ask you for your number and you're not giving your number to that person. Why? Because of their intentions and how you try to measure given the context, given the situation, you look at that and you say, you know what, this is something that I can participate in, right? So when we talk about this idea of the pricked heart, we have to look for the hardness in our heart and turn it so that we can find those places where we can relate. I know of some young people who were taking that in a different kind of way, and I started thinking about why they were doing it, because I couldn't imagine why they would self-harm in this way. And they were, and so I sat down and I asked, I said, you know, so, and it was an atmosphere where we could have open dialogue. So I wasn't doing a 21, question kind of thing, but we had an open dialogue. And they said to me that they did that so that they could feel. And so I talked about it. I said, so what do you mean you can't feel? They had so many trauma and so many calluses that they thought that this was the only way they could feel. And so we started talking about what are some other ways that you can feel? What are some ways that you can be vulnerable that in ways that are safe? Who are people that you have relationships with that can allow you to kind of shave off that pumice stone in some particular areas so that you can get back to feeling? And one of the things that the young person I ended up talking about was the fact that part of their cutting became a self-fulfilling prophecy for them, and that it was actually a tool to isolate themselves from other people, which reinforced everything that they were thinking about themselves. And so we started having conversations about not keeping secrets, being open, having someone to confide in, and talking with people, and blah, 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 blah. And lo and behold, after a period of time, cutting did not become their main strategy for dealing with stress and for feeling, right? And so sometimes as good people, we can become callous in how we see the world, how we see ourselves, and how we see our relationships with other people. And one of the ways that good people like us become callous is that we'll say something. And I want you to start thinking about every time that you've said this or you've heard someone say this, and I want you to twist that to a new way of saying this or a new way of thinking. Because typically what particular people in the dominant group will say is that those people are like us. And those people are not like us. But we like the people who are like us. But I want you to flip that around, because if we want to get to a place where we diminish the impacts of racism and sexism and heterosexism, we need this paradigm shift. That I am like them. I am like those people. They don't have to be like me because I am like them. I was in a workshop the other day, and we're doing an activity that I often do. I think it's on your worksheet number 3. I do that activity in most sessions that I start with. And someone wrote on their thing, and it's about values. So we have them write down their values and share those values with one another. And one woman wrote down this idea that black skin as a thing was valuable to her. She thought it was beautiful. So beautiful black skin is what she wrote on her thing. And another woman was talking and saw her thing, and the woman that brought this up was a white woman. And she said, I was confused by that statement of beautiful black skin. And so I encouraged them to have a dialogue. And so I asked the woman who wrote it down, I said, well, what did you mean by that? She said, I meant that the color and the texture and the richness of black skin is beautiful. And the other woman who was a searcher, she was looking to be an ally, to build an ally, her thought of skin being beautiful. So she had never really, that concept of skin being beautiful was a foreign concept for her. But then to put black skin with that, it took her a while to see that, to see herself and the other, to see that black skin was beautiful. When we get to this point where we can say, I am like them, situations like this story I'm about to tell won't happen. So there was a gentleman who was an undersheriff in a county, and I won't name that county, and the administrative assistant for his department, they had kids about the same age, and they would share stories back and forth about their kids. They would go to lunch from time to time. The administrative person would do his time cards, so she knew how much money he made and all this kind of stuff. And so one day he gets off of work a little early and goes home and changes into his civilian clothes. So he was in uniform all day. He changes into civilian clothes, and he likes to wear kind of baggy jeans, not sagging, but loose fit kind of jeans, and a nice jean jacket. And he has he has a baseball hat that he wears a little lower on the brim, and he likes gold, so he has on gold chains and whatnot. And he has a cart full of groceries, and he's pushing his aisle down the groceries, and he sees his coworker at the grocery store, and excited to see her, he rushes his cart over to her cart, and he says, Gladys! And Gladys looks at him, and she clutches her purse. And he looks at her and he says, Gladys? And she looks and she says, oh, Tommy. And he says, Gladys, I'm through with you. And she's like, what? It was like, you mean to tell me after 6 years, you don't know my face after 6 years? You don't recognize that you know how much I make, and you clutch your purse? Now, granted, I will tell you that I have certainly seen people out of context. I've seen people that I've known from one place and seen them in some other place, and it took me a while to kind of figure it out and that kind of thing. But I thought this was very interesting because he was so impacted by this. He was so impacted by this. And one of the things that he said to me that I thought was very interesting was that he said he felt that Gladys never saw him as a human being. She saw him as a lanyard. She saw him as a uniform. And the question that he said led him to that conclusion was, she said, now he's got a cart full of groceries. She's got a cart full of groceries. And she asked this question: what are you doing here? What's the question behind her question? How could you be where I am? Why? Because she saw him like her, but she never saw her like him. And so when we start talking about this idea of pricking our heart, it is about turning our heart to a position where we can see how we are like the other person. So I love working with white supremacists and racists. I love it because they're the most honest people. They're the most honest. They tell it like it is, how they're thinking. And what I know is that they weren't born like that. They were taught to be like that, or they learned to be like that, which excites me because as a teacher, if they learned how to be like that, I can teach them something else, right? And so when we talk about that, it really is about us trying to see how we're like other people. And that the pricks in our heart aren't bad things. They're a cognitive discipline that we must continually to do, just like that pumice stone, to get those calluses off where they don't need to be. Because some of the calluses need to stay. But there are some places in our life where the calluses don't need to be. And so how do we get there? How do we do that? I'm going over my time, I apologize. If you go to the back part of your handout, in the royal blue there's dignity and honor in being human. Recognizing that the people that you're working with are having similar human experiences that you are. They're having similar human challenges that you are. So giving them the dignity, giving them respect, not that they have to be, change, or grow to be something different, but just because they are, you can give them dignity and honor, the highest form of respect. Right? And who do we give honor to? We give honor to those people who have done things for us that we couldn't do for ourselves. Servicemen and women we give honor to. Our ancestors, our grandparents, we give them honor because they did things on our behalf. And lastly, this idea of being. We did nothing to bring ourselves here. We accepted an invitation. I don't like to think about how that invitation came. It's disgusting. But we accepted an invitation and we're trying to figure out what it means to be human. And human is a noun and an adjective. And what do adjectives do? They describe what? The noun. So how do we want to be described? Because that becomes the answer to how do we prick our heart. I have to give people what I need in order for me to get it. So if I need patience, I have to give people patience before I get it. If I want to be friendly, I have to be friendly before I get friends. And so that pricked heart says, turn it around to that uncalloused part. Scrape off the calluses. Look where you have to prick your heart so you can feel again and recognize that the other is not the other is you. My name is Andre Cohen. Thank you so much for your time. So we were done at 1. I'm 5 over. If you have to leave, feel free. If you have questions, I'll entertain those. Take sandwiches. We did not get those to take home.
You said that last thing that you said that I need to give people.
I need to give people what I need. And that's not an original thought. That comes out of Gandhi's conversations with the reformation of his country. So it's a paraphrase on some things that Gandhi has said.
I like to say something to that.
Yes.
I like to give people what I need.
Yes.
So for me, I'm giving people, I need to be listened to.
Yeah.
So I have to be able to listen. So right now, what's moved my heart is to create these stories, these horrific storytelling events that I've incurred living here, being a Black woman, not a woman,
Yep.
in Minnesota. And so I'm doing that because I want to be able to be listened to